Hello and welcome to a new episode, this time with Ute Kollies. Ute Kollies worked for the United Nations in the Department of Humanitarian Aid for more than 20 years. She was the director of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Mali. She worked and lived in Chad, the Ivory Coast, and Sudan. She was the deputy head of office in Senegal, where she was responsible for the whole West African region. Dear Ute, I thank you very much that you followed my invitation, and I'm very glad and honored to talk to you.
Yes, I'm also glad, and I feel privileged that I've been invited.
So before we start before you can talk about the peace conference that you attended in Vienna, where we met each other and spoke to each other, please explain to me, how do you get interested in the African region, how your UN career started, and what was your motivation to get involved in humanitarian affairs and humanitarian aid and all the work that you have been done.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually quite a long story because I started being interested in Africa when I was 14 years old. During our geography course, we learned about the African countries, the colonization, and also the geography. And during that time, Africa was always depicted as a very special environment, very underdeveloped, in need of assistance and support, as the people were living, in an environment that was fragile, often in a situation of conflict, and also threatened by the fragile environment and environmental challenges. So I started writing to the University of Witwatersrand because I was convinced I should learn an African language. And I still have the books because I tried to learn Zulu at the time. And years later, I was teaching South Africans who had been invited by the German government to undergo training in Germany. And I met Zulus and they were laughing at me because obviously if you learn Zulu by yourself, you are not able to express yourself in the way that Zulu is spoken, especially, the click sounds. So during that time, my interest in Africa even became more passionate because I heard about the struggles of liberation of South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, because I was teaching and tutoring students from those countries while I myself was studying. So this was like a way to make money on the side to support my student life. And I got involved very strongly in the Anti-Apartheid-Movement and all the support that was available in Germany to people who were struggling to liberate themselves. I then decided, when I had finished my studies, to emigrate to Zimbabwe, which became independent exactly when I was about to finalize my thesis. Because I was convinced that I could help develop new strategies and support the liberation, which is also a mental liberation. The liberation from colonialism is one thing, and the military or the armed struggle is one thing, but the struggle for mental liberation is even more important. So I left with $500, 2 suitcases, and a box of long playing records and books to start my life in Harare, Zimbabwe. And I was lucky enough to get a job offer nearly straight away from an organization, a German organization that worked there, that facilitated the reintegration of the same students I had taught in Germany, German to foreigners, and who had in the meantime also finished their training and needed to be reintegrated in Zimbabwe. I stayed in Zimbabwe for over 15 years because I was married to a Zimbabwean national, and I grew my family there. And since you ask how I arrived in the United Nations and also in the field of humanitarian assistance, it played a major role as I experienced life in the newly liberated Zimbabwe. You can imagine that a country that had suffered from apartheid-type structures and mechanisms, discrimination was still very high between black and white, and a lot of white Rhodesians, I should say, decided to leave the country because they didn't want to be governed by a black government. So there were a lot of problems in filling posts, for instance, for teachers in the rural areas, but also in towns, because after independence, the student population grew from formerly 300,000 students for the whole country, mainly for white children, but with a few black children also being able to go to mission schools, to 1.8 million children. Now, you can imagine that a government cannot say, well, you know, we are liberated, but you have to wait for education. You know, you cannot say that. You have to do something pretty quickly. And there was a need to address the issue of content of education, because obviously the white curriculum was a white curriculum, telling the students all about, you know, the civilization that white people had brought to the continent and so on. And the new black government was obviously very interested, under Minister Mutumbuka at the time, to change this for a more African-centered way to teach. And so I was involved in curriculum development on the one hand, but I was also involved in what they called the teachers program. Germany had sent over 750 German teachers, and other countries as well sent teachers and teacher trainers to Zimbabwe in order to accommodate all these 1.8 million students as quickly as possible in a new education system. I was responsible for the placement of teachers, so I virtually ran around the country with a kind of a small Renault, a Peugeot that I drove at the time. And I can say that maybe Zimbabwe is the country I know the best in terms of the geography, because I've been to the places that are most remote, and I've been to places that are very difficult to reach, because we were looking for teacher placements in those areas, in the rural areas, but also in towns. And at the same time, we were placing teacher trainers into the training institutions, so that the foreign teachers could slowly but surely go back to their countries and be replaced by Zimbabwean teachers. Obviously, this will take a couple of years. And that was one of the projects and programs that I really was very interested in, because it changed the system, and it gave Zimbabwe, I think, one of the best education systems at the time. Zimbabwe has been known as one of the countries with the least illiteracy. And Zimbabweans, if they go overseas, which they have done following the demise of the country, the economic demise of the country, they often can immediately receive job offers if they have studied in Zimbabwe, if they have been trained in Zimbabwe, because the quality of education at the time, I'm talking now about the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s maybe, was very high. A lot of students came to us from Botswana, from Namibia, from Mozambique, from Tanzania, and so on, because this system was the best in the sub-region. At the same time, we were busy with the reintegration of those Zimbabweans that had received, training in Germany at the time. A lot of them were, trained in kind of hand jobs like fitter and turner, plumber, electricians, and so on, but also chemical engineers, doctors, and so on. And as you know, Germany has a different system, not only in terms of metric system, but we have a different way of training. And so there was a lot of work that needed to be done to get the equations of those certificates that people had received. While I was in Zimbabwe, we had, and I was there for over 15 years, we had unfortunately twice a big drought. and I saw the impact of drought and the hunger related and or as a consequence. And that brought me more and more into the thinking that, the first support that we need to give is to the populations that need the most support, and not those that are already well on their way to develop their careers and so on and so forth. But while I was there, I really enjoyed these different programs. We also had scholarship programs for people from Namibia, Mozambique, and so on to go to school or university in Zimbabwe because the quality was so much better. And some of them have returned to their countries since then and have taken up very high jobs in their own societies. So it's something to be really proud of, I think. But after having spent 15 years in Zimbabwe, I unfortunately noticed, like many others, that the country was about to go into a direction of economic decline and also possibly conflict between the different ethnic groups. We have had survived already the time of what we called Gukurahundi, the cleanup operation that the Zimbabwean government had ordered following the misinterpretation of the Zipra-Zapu leadership that was declared, to mount maybe a coup d'etat or becoming a terrorist threat. And so a lot of people don't know that during that time, over 20,000 Ndebelés were killed. There is reports about that. But during that time, the then president, Mr. Mugabe, was very much liked in the West. Because he was the leader of the frontline states. South Africa was not yet free. Namibia was not yet free. And generally, the politicians who came to visit Zimbabwe were impressed, with what had been done in education, what had been done in the health system as well, because, you could go to the hospital and get treatment for free if you belonged to the group that had only the minimum wage. So there were, it's never black and white only, it's like at the same time, some things are very good, other things are not that good. And after these 15 years, I asked myself, if this country is deteriorating, maybe I should start applying to go to other places. And that's when I came across a huge, I think it was even a whole page publication in Die Zeit, where the United Nations was, publishing that they are looking for German nationals because Germany had paid or continues to pay a lot of money to support the United Nations, but didn't have the equivalent people in the system. So they were underrepresented. There's other countries now that are underrepresented, but during that time, Germany was underrepresented. And so I thought, oh, let me apply. And I did apply, and I was invited to write the test in Frankfurt, in the town hall of Frankfurt. According to what I heard, over 3,000 people had applied, and 700 were invited to write the test. I arrived from Zimbabwe. I will never forget it because it was my birthday, the 2nd of February, I wrote the test. And I arrived in Frankfurt. There was snow in Frankfurt. I arrived from Zimbabwe. I was late. The taxi was stuck, in traffic and so on. When I came out of the taxi, I fell, my stockings were torn. I arrived in the town hall. I looked like somebody who had been, like in a disaster zone. And you have to, when you do these types of assessments with the United Nations, you have to identify yourself with your passport. And the person at the door said, well, but the test has already started, 30 minutes, you're late. You will not get additional time. to write the test. Are you still interested to write the test? And I said, absolutely, because I have come from Zimbabwe all the way for this test. It's my birthday, as you can see. I hope that this will give me luck. And so I did write the test, and out of the 700, I think about 50 passed the test. And out of the 50, we were invited then to the second part of the assessment in New York, which was an oral assessment, because they wanted to check you are supposed to speak at least two UN languages, English and French for me. And so you had a 3-day assessment in New York, which I participated in. Out of the 30 or 40 people who were there, 3 finally made it. So that was something quite extraordinary, I felt. And one of them was me. And I got a job offer more or less 1.5 years later. So the whole process from the first written test to the oral test to the final offer of a job took over 4 years. However, I must say, I was interested not only to apply, never mind to which organization. I actually had read quite a bit about the United Nations before, also in preparation for the test. But, I find that the UN-Charta is maybe one of the things that is to be admired. I do know that there's a lot of what is written that is not followed. But the document itself, even from the very start, when it says, we the peoples, and at the time when the UN was created, it didn't include the whole globe. It included, I think it was 45 countries. And so the majority of the globe was not included. But the Charter remains until today, because we the peoples will include everybody that is then admitted as a member. And so the UN went through a couple of changes, growing after the different wars of liberation had happened. The third world became more powerful, the global south. And so now, as you know, we have 193 member states in the UN. Talking about we the peoples, I mean, you then also have to look at what is actually the content of the Charter. And the Charter talks about fundamental rights. It underscores human rights. It underscores dignity of people. It talks about justice for all. It talks about social progress. And it talks about the practice of tolerance. I would say, as a matter of fact, I would rather call it acceptance, because tolerance is still, sort of talking from a hierarchical point of being superior. I tolerate you. But I think, if I say I accept you, that means we are on an equal footing, if you like. And it talks about to live in peace and security. I mean, all these things are extremely valuable, I think, even though we know that the opposite nearly happens, and that the setup of the United Nations also prevents, that the majority of the countries that are organized in the United Nations can actually advance their ideas. Because, as you know, we have the permanent 5, who have a veto rights. And even if only one of them vetoes, all the other 190-something countries have to sort of give up on what they wanted and have no chance to push this through, which I think is something that could potentially now be more questioned and more put under scrutiny with the developments following the Ukraine-Russia conflict. You have seen the strengthening. I think as we speak, there's a BRICS meeting in South Africa. And, there is at the moment, the last time I looked, the foreign minister there, Naledi Pandor, I think she has already said that over 20 countries have applied to become members of the BRICS. There's also, I think, what they call the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is also being strengthened. I think all this is somehow an opportunity to make right what is not right with the UN at the moment, because obviously the people who hold the P5 positions are not interested to change this power position for something less powerful. I do think that if you look at the Charter as well, they say that armed force shall not be used. I mean, this is in a way nearly satirical, because we have this in writing as the Charter and the basis for our living together on this planet. But how many times has it been violated since the Charter has been written? And so the last one is obviously promote economic and social advancement for all peoples once again. And there we have to talk about neo-colonial structures, obviously, that continue, even though colonialism as such, the period where the colon was in the country and really oppressed and discriminated the indigenous people is over since approximately the early 60s. I think the first country was Ghana in 1957 to become independent. But the neo-colonial structures are still there. And these are, as you know, mostly established through what I call bad trade relations. It's trade relations that, for instance, if you look at the latest developments in Niger and the coup d'etat there, Niger is one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in the world, but it has huge uranium mines in the north of the country. Only that the majority of what is mined there is going to France, and obviously not for prices that help the development of the country, because the people who live around the mining area are all getting sick from the radioactive stuff, and there is no hospital, there is no help, there's no, and just to give you an example of one of the structures that are still functioning through the neo-colonial issues. Now, I started to work for the United Nations. That's also maybe an interesting experience in 1999 in Geneva. And, you know, you asked me about my experience in Geneva. I mean, first of all, you know, you are remote from the areas that you actually want to help. I was working immediately for OCHA and responsible for what they called the IESC Secretariat, the Interagency Standing Committee. I mean, it was a lot of paper writing and, you know, presenting information about all the countries in disasters, that's natural disasters. Like I still remember, you know, we had the earthquake in Algeria, we had the tsunami, we had, you know, earthquakes in South America and so on, and conflict areas. And if you look across the globe, most of the blue helmets have been deployed in Africa, because most of the conflicts remained on the continent of Africa. And there you could also say maybe this is related to the way that colonization and decolonization happened. Because unfortunately, as you know, we had the Berlin Conference in 1883, I think, where the borders of Africa were, you know, put with a ruler. This has destroyed areas, community areas for specific ethnic groups. And this has caused people who were forced to live together now to live together and have different you know, interests and so on. So I think, you know, there's certainly a connection there, and there's a lot that need to be done in Africa. And I was quite happy, first of all, to be in Geneva, because I was a single mom at the time and my daughter was still in school. So obviously you can't go to war zones when you have such a family situation. But, you know, as soon as my daughter was older and virtually going on with her own studies and so on. I went to the field, and also while I was in Geneva, I had various positions there. I try to travel at least as much as possible to the continent, because I believe that you cannot talk about a situation if you haven't smelt it, you haven't touched it, you haven't felt it, you haven't spoken to people of different backgrounds, because life is complicated. Just to listen, for instance, to the government side in a country is not going to give you the picture of what is happening. Just to talk to people in the capital city in a 5-star hotel is not going to give you the understanding of what is going on in the country. So I've traveled a lot, not only to countries and into capitals, but beyond capitals, into what we used to call the deep field. But for me, it's just the normality. I always feel that the capital city is still, much more related to the level of development that we are accustomed to. So I think it is really important, if you want to understand humanitarian problems, to go into the areas where people are hungry, where people have problems to access water, where people have no access to health, where there is no school functioning, and so on and so forth, and to really understand from the point of view of women, men, young, old, different ethnic groups, what is their take on the situation. And that's when you can make up your mind and write up a proper analysis and maybe a proposal for what can be done. So this is how I arrived in the United Nations, with a critical eye, already knowing about the shortcomings and the power and hierarchical structures, but at the same time, with a lot of hope that, we can change things for the better wherever we are.
Sounds amazing. And so many questions came out, because you spoke about poverty and hunger, starvation, earthquakes. And my question here is, how did you mentally cope with such things, living there, seeing that there are people in need, and all this illiteracy, hunger, starvation, natural disasters? I mean, and even the brink of civil war or riots, conflicts, and so on and so forth. So how did you felt it, and how did you mentally cope with such situation?
It's interesting, because I am not religious, so religion is not giving me that type of support, which a lot of people are going to, and I understand that. But for me, it was more, it doesn't help to close your eyes. I actually feel sometimes, the superficiality that exists here in Europe about such suffering is unsupportable for me. Actually, this is more of a mental problem for me than looking at somebody who has this problem, but then doing something about it. And I think that is probably the answer, that, I am not responsible for the suffering of all these people, but I am one of many people who is daring to go. And, this is something which I really want to say. If you are a humanitarian, you have to embrace that risk. There is a risk level that you have to be prepared to accept. You can minimize risk by doing a lot of things when you go into these areas, because you can't talk to mines. There's always a threat of mines. And I actually have been a victim of a mine explosion. I have lost a little bit of my left ear capacity to hear. But, there is a lot that can be done to minimize risk. You can negotiate with the armed groups. You can define humanitarian corridors. You can, do everything that is possible. You can use an armored vehicle to go someplace. You can adapt. I mean, I've been in northern Mali many times in the traditional northern Malian voile, which is, the thing that you wrap around yourself so that you are not immediately identified as a foreigner. I mean, obviously, you still remain that, but it's not an immediate identification. And I think, the most important thing is to establish relationships with all the people and to be humane to everybody, because it's often the beggar on the street who is going to alert you to something that is going on in your area where you live, and who will tell you you better stay home tomorrow, maybe. So if you don't talk to the beggar, you won't know, and you will continue to expose yourself maybe to a threat that you're not even aware of. This is what I think I can say, that as long as you are able to do something about this, it's actually more satisfying than mentally challenging. Where it is mentally challenging is when you, for instance, I'm thinking of a young man we evacuated from Djibok in Mali, following an incident where the car that he was driving in had hit a mine, and he had lost both his legs. 19 years old. And we managed to transfer him from Gao, which is about 1,000 kilometers from Bamako, to Bamako. We lifted him to Bamako to go to hospital. But, he just survived another 3 days, and, then he died. And these are the things that stay with you. That somebody that young, for no reason at all, just bad luck, lost his life in such a terrible way as well. He really suffered for those 3 days. And these are the things where you have to say, well, you tried your best, but you failed. It happens. But I rather do that than do nothing. And I rather face all this and try my best than close my eyes and say, well, I have a life. I can go and swim. I can go to the cinema. I can enjoy myself. The sun is shining. Yes, you do that too, because you need to. Otherwise, you burn out. But you have to sort of be able to find an equilibrium. And I have always had hobbies. I've always read a lot. I've painted. I sang. You have to find other things where you distract yourself, if you like, from all the suffering, because unfortunately you are never able to help everybody. And again, it's not your fault. There's not enough money. There's not enough donors. I still remember when my former supervisor came from New York, and we were sitting in the middle of nowhere in an area where we were receiving protection from rebel groups. It was a very uncomfortable situation. We were surrounded by 80, sort of highly armed young men, all covered behind their turbans and so on, all speaking a language we couldn't understand. They could have talked to each other to say, let's kidnap these two, let's go and bring them there. We wouldn't have known. And my supervisor, he gave a speech, and he said, what is most disappointing in this world, because he was addressing the NGOs there and the humanitarian actors on the ground in Menaka. And he said, the most disturbing thing in the world is, and I agree there, money is there. There is money. But the money is, and we have seen that recently, is, it comes out of nowhere. You don't know where it's coming from. Millions and trillions are coming to buy weapons, to make war, to go to war or support a party to a conflict. But you never have the similar amount of money for humanitarian action. And he said he sometimes feels, and I felt that too, that if you would compare a country that is in this type of, humanitarian need, where you have maybe hundreds of thousands of people, or even millions who need support. If you would compare that with a human being that has had a severe accident, maybe lost an arm, and is bleeding from the arm, and somebody just gives you a little plaster, to close it. You can't close, the wound that is created by, let's say, an amputation of an arm by a plaster. And that's what is constantly being done. And this is maybe more of the mental challenge, to know that the politicians that are in place in the countries that are economically well are unwilling to dedicate the right amount of money to the situations of humanitarian need that are often created by the very weapons that they are selling, to the belligerents. So, this is something that is not easy. But I mean, if you are a conscient person, there is so many contradictions in life, that you have to find an equilibrium. At the same time, you have to be able to find joy, even though there is a lot of suffering. And that suffering is also happening in our part of the world. If you look at the suicide rates in the Western world, if you look at the drug addiction, if you look at the isolation of old people, if you look at alcoholism, there's so many things in the Western world as well, that, I'm not so sure, whether we can say all the problems exist only on that other side, where this humanitarian situation is.
Yeah, I totally agree, yes. And I also agree with you on the assessment that the UN Charter is maybe the greatest written law humanity ever applied or has written. I agree with that as well. I'm an outsider, so I never worked for the UN, inside the UN, so I don't have an overview or knowledge. But I have the question, why did the UN Charter fail? And is it because of big powers who do not respect the Charter and are selfish, act unilateral? Or is it because, as you told us before, that money is going in the wrong direction in the weapons system and military? How or is it because the institution itself has also some sort of a colonial history, maybe problem? I don't know. Maybe because they are not effective. I imagine that there are a lot of nice people there, talking many languages and are capable of many things, but their only thing is they are doing nice presentations and talking nice to each other, but that's not enough. So help me understand the failure of this big institution. And also a very interesting point you made is that that they are not equal treatment. For example, India, China, they not have the same weight in expressing their opinion and voting system and many other things. So please let's dig deeper into the UN system and the institution and why the UN Charter failed.
Well, it's a big question, no? You could probably talk a couple of days on this. I'm not sure whether I have like all the answers, but you alluded already to some of it, and we've talked about it. The political setup is such that the P5, the permanent five, can stop any proposal from other countries or even from proposals within the P5. And so, if one country can virtually stop everything that 192 other countries find useful, you first of all have to ask yourself, where is the democracy in that? You have 5 countries that are, if you like, coming out of the Second World War. If you look at them, they are not, first of all, they are not representing the majority of the world population. Secondly, there is no representative, neither from South America nor from Africa, nor, I would say, even from Asia and the Middle East, even though China is in. But I'm sure that India would not feel happy if somebody would suggest, because China is in Asia, you are represented. I don't think that the Middle Eastern countries are happy. None of the Arab states hold any power. I don't have an answer to it. I'm not saying the Security Council should be enlarged or should be differently configured. But I do think that, with the changes that happened, especially following the 1960s and the decolonization of the global South, something should have happened then to facilitate a better inclusion and a better equity and equality. Obviously, there's also the debate between tiny countries and big countries. Somebody who's got like China or India, 1.3, 1.4 billion people cannot be represented with one person, like the Gambia or Vanuatu or some of the smaller countries. I mean, these are just some of the problems. Never mind the problem of racism in the setup, because none of the faces around the P5 are black. And there is, in Africa alone, there's over 1.3 billion people as well. So the political issue is one. There is, I think, also the fact that, the United Nations is not a company. It's not like the Secretary General is not like a chief executive officer. He can't make a decision and say, okay, we're going to do it like this, because he's dependent on the member states. He's virtually like well, it says secretary, he's like a secretary general to all the member states. So he has to take into consideration, a lot of different views and, sometimes very opposing views. And, what do you come up with? How do you formulate so that it's appealing to even the opponent? It is complicated. The third thing is there's a lot of problems related to the functioning of the hyper-capitalist globalized system. The countries that are functioning in this way have no interest in looking at what can be done, for instance, the issue of climate change or global warming or global cooling, we don't know, but certainly there's something happening with the climate that is not in order. But we are unable to address it because of issues of making money with, the fossil fuels, with resources that they don't want to give up, etc. pp. So they're very complicated issues. And for that, you could have the most intelligent person to run the organization. There is the limits of all these power positions that are linked to the economic system, that are linked to hegemonical ideas, that are linked to military prowess, that are linked to, ethnic and religious hyper-identification. There is so many things that it's a complicated matter. At the same time, I must say, I also think that the internal management, could be better. But the issue is often that the people are so overstretched that, you can't dedicate enough time to actually figure out what could be done better. I mean, there's constant evaluations about efficiency, for instance. But I would say, especially in the humanitarian field, I've often, been in opposition to that, because you need to have humane relationships. And to establish that, you have to have time. You can't arrive in a situation where there's 30,000 IDPs and you've been there, you've interviewed a few people, which is already very complicated due to the fact that the majority of them don't speak your language. You need a translator. Is the translator neutral? What is he saying? Is he politically aligned to any of the groups, especially if there's conflict? You don't know. But you speak to them and it doesn't make a relation, it doesn't create a relationship. You've only been there once. You've only been there that one time, even if you've spoken for maybe a half an hour to one person, you know, it's not like you have a relationship. If you want to have relationships, you need time, and you need to go to those places more often. And that is another problem. We have a security system in place that often makes it very difficult for you to go to those areas. I always say, you know, where there are humanitarians, there's danger. But, you know, yes, I'm not suicidal, but you have to, as I said before, you have to minimize risks, and you have to be prepared to accept that and then go there. But if the system that is there says you are not allowed to go, except if you take, let's say, a tank to precede you and a tank to go behind you, what do you think is happening in a displaced camp if you arrive with a tank in front and a tank behind? These people know what war is. They will all run away. So, you know, you can't always do it the way you want it. And sometimes you have internal fights, you know, to address this and say to the security guys, listen, I have done the negotiation. I will be careful, but, you know, I have to go this particular way. And sometimes it's not possible, because the thing is, if you do it against the rules, then your insurance is not going to kick in if anything happens to you. There's very few people who are prepared to do this. And I understand, because that means, you know, should anything happen, let's say you are injured or you're killed, you know, your family is not going to get anything. This is it. So you are between a rock and a hard place often. That's very problematic. I think, you know, the UN needs more support, but you do know that we have a number of member states that are extremely critical. And, you know, we have also not regular payments to the UN and things like that. That doesn't make it easier. But I think also, you know, the issue of reform has been on the table many, many times. And I think there's a lot of reports about, you know, how we can change for the better. It's unfortunate that, you know, some of these things were pretty useful, but never got, you know, the support needed to be able to be put in place. So we are still very much, I think, a child of the beginning of the UN, and it has sort of stayed that way. We've become bigger in terms of, you know, the staff and so on. And obviously we do more than we used to do because there's more to be done. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And yeah, I think this is something that needs constant attention by, you know, not only the member states, but by the employees themselves, you know.
I understand. Yes, it's complicated. I found an article. I'm not sure if it was an interview you gave, but the topic was something like hunger as a weapon. Could you explain the economic, geopolitical, and political interests behind such things like structural adjustment programs and the different form of dependency that goes with, for example, humanitarian aid that goes along with, yeah, many things like that. Why is it not so simple, this narrative? Let's deconstruct this narrative of, yeah, we, the white people from the global north, are the good guys, and we help them and we support them. We gave them food and humanitarian aid, and they cannot stand on their own feet, and they are not well prepared. They don't have institutions, and this liberal argument I faced in my master thesis, that people from the global, especially liberals, use this argument. Yeah, weak institutions, they're not capable of democracy, and that's why they have such a weak economy, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, I read Jean Ziegler, a special rapporteur on the right to food. And he said people do not starve to death, they get killed. And then if you you know, understand this sentence, it's yeah, wow. It changed your mind on the topic. And then he moved on and said that it's not about giving them more, it's about not taking something from them, not stealing from them. And then yeah, so he refers to the colonial and new colonial structures. So yeah, let's discuss this another big topic.
Yeah, it's true. Huh? I mean, about structural adjustment programs, you know, I was in Zimbabwe when we had the so-called ESAP, Economic Structural Adjustment Program, which was titled by Zimbabweans, Extreme Suffering for African People. It's the same, ESAP, Extreme Suffering for African People. Because when this arrived in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government was requested to stop all subsidies for the health system, the education system, and so on. And remember, we had an extremely good education system, and we had also for the region an extremely good health system. I myself gave birth in Zimbabwe. I've had 3 operations in Zimbabwe. I mean, it was really, you know, for the region, it was really a very good health system. And the Zimbabwean government, I'm not sure about the timeline since it's now so long ago, but a couple of months, let's put it that way, after the implementation of this program, the Zimbabwe government decided to do an evaluation of the impact. I already said that in the 80s, if you were somebody who had a minimum wage in Zimbabwe, you could go to a hospital and be treated without payment. You needed you needed your salary slip or something, you know, but you didn't have to pay. You would be treated. Pregnant women could give birth without paying, you know, you didn't have to pay. Now, with the structural adjustment program, all of a sudden, you were supposed to pay $10 to go to the hospital. Now, people who live in the rural areas, they don't even make money. You know, they live in the fields, they provide their own food. They don't even have cash on hand unless they sell some of the food that they grow. And it's extremely difficult to get $10 together to go to a hospital. It's, you know, people sometimes don't understand how difficult it is to get such a minimal amount of money for people who never make regular money. And the same for the schools. All of a sudden, the subsidies for schools were you know, stopped, which meant that if you were poor, you know, you had to buy your own books, you had to get your uniform, you had to pay for the school, all this kind of thing. And people started dropping out because, you know, they couldn't afford to bring their children to school. What often happens then is usually the girls are the first that drop out, because, you know, the traditional beliefs or the religious beliefs say, well, you know, the girls, they will get married and then they become mothers. They don't need really to go to school, which was not the case when there were the subsidies. All the children went to school. There was no real problem with, you know, schooling girls. And so that was the impact of this particular ESAP. There's a professor, I think he's Ethiopian, if I'm not mistaken, Fantu Chero, who wrote extensively about the impact of structural adjustment programs in a number of countries in Africa. I mean, it's criminal. It is criminal because it hits the poorest the most. The rich people will always be able to pay $10 to go to a hospital. They actually fly outside the country. I mean, if you look at the political elite in many countries, if they are sick, they take the next flight and they are, you know, nowadays they go to Singapore or, you know, China if they don't go to Europe. And, you know, I think this is something that is really abhorrent because the poor can't do that. And in many cases, it means if you can't pay, you die. You are not going to be treated. So some of them have a little bit of money and then they go and see the traditional doctor, the marabout in West Africa, you know, or the witch doctor in Southern Africa. But that is not treatment. That is not necessarily, you know, what you need. It can give you a little bit of, and that was also proven in Zimbabwe, it can give you a lot of help if you have mental issues. You know, it really is related to culture and, you know, integration into community and so on. But, you know, and they can maybe treat certain sicknesses with herbs and so on. I mean, it's a bit comparable to, you know, people in Europe believing in this homeopathic, you know, globally and all this kind of stuff. I think, you know, they can do certain things, but there is issues like cancer and other things. There is not much that these doctors can do. And that means poor people are, as Jean Ziegler has said, they're condemned to die. But, you know, it wasn't maybe necessary. It could have been an appendicitis where if you have an immediate intervention is not a big problem. But if you don't have the money, that's it. It's the end of you. So, you know, the way the system is set up, that's what the Zimbabwean government proved. And I think they have very quickly then moved out of this program. There was a lot of, you know, meetings between the World Bank, the IMF, who were all responsible for this, you know, kind of a remedy for the country, which in the end was not a remedy, but made it much worse. I think with food, it's another issue. You know, I mean, I've just finished writing an article, not about that particular topic, but where I made a remark about the fact that, you know, intellectual property is something that has an impact on the production of food. You know, especially if you talk about the seeds. Intellectual property has been declared by many multinationals on certain groups of seeds. And so they want to create a kind of a dependency on the genetically modified seeds that you need to buy every year. And you can't, you know, create seeds from your last harvest, which again makes you dependent and forces you to enter into the cash society. So you have to make money. I mean, that's the overall goal of all these organizations and people, companies, and so on. They want to make money. So they want to find opportunities that people who have been independent, who have been growing their own food, cannot do so for a longer period of time because they need to buy every time the seeds you know, necessary to regrow this. In this respect, you know, Ananda Shiva is the one from India who is fighting a lot against, you know, that type of thing. There's other things that are also very complicated. I mean, even in the humanitarian system, I have seen in the early 2000s, and it exists on, still, you know, World Food Program receives a lot of donations in kind, not in money. And the in-kind donations come from mainly America, but also Western Europe, from all the production, agricultural production that was, you know, supported, you know, and the farmers are out farming the African farmers, if you like. And they produce things that they then give, you know, to WFP for distribution, which is not necessarily the food that the people eat. So, you know, sometimes people get sick because they are not used to that particular food. And WFP has started, you know, a couple of years back already, to buy food within the region where it's supposed to be distributed, not only to give an incentive to the economy of the, you know, the local economy, but also to use the food that people are, you know, used to. So yeah, unfortunately, you know, what Jean Ziegler is right, says is right. That you know, the way that we deal, you know, with issues of environmental degradation, climate change, and so on and so forth, it unfortunately touches the populations that do the least to impact on the environment, you know, the most. They are already very fragile. They're already very poor. They live in an environment that is extremely harsh. And because of the behavior of the rich North, West, I don't know how to define it now, but this impact gets worse and worse. And unfortunately, because it has not yet reached the level of suffering in the countries that are developed, they just continue to behave the way they behave. And, the consequences are borne by the people far away that we don't identify with, that don't even appear often on the television or in the news because there's nothing newsworthy. And, as I said with what's happening in Niger, I think, for years, probably Niger has not been in the news. And all of a sudden, everybody is talking about Niger. This is also, the way that the media treats, the emergency in the world. They never give you a proper analysis of how this happened, where this happened, why this happened, and so on. You just get a snippet, and for about maybe 5 days, you are bombarded with the same messages, about that particular region, or how many people have been killed, or democracy has been taken to the grave, and what do we do now? And it is not, unfortunately, enough for the populations in the developed countries to understand what's going on. And so the victimization of the victims continues all the time, because, why are they living like that? They are not capable. They are unable. We are already giving so much help for all these years, and all this kind of argument that you hear, where you wonder, how come that they can actually maintain this idea that we are the helpers. Individually, we might be the ones to help, like my colleagues and myself and a lot of NGO people and the ICRC and all these people. But as a system, the same nationalities are also responsible for creating the situations that these people are in, unfortunately. And so, the influence of the colonial and neo-colonial strings of France in the Sahel, have led to what we are seeing now, unfortunately.
Absolutely, yeah, I understand you. And here, before the interview, I talked about Claudia Brunner's book on epistemic violence, and this is exactly now what you described. This is epistemic violence, the disparity between the knowledge and the knowledge production, and the contribution of knowledge in order to stabilize a certain, power structure and hegemony. And I quote Claudia. She said, "By epistemic violence, I understand the very contribution to violent societal conditions that is rooted in knowledge itself, in formation, shape, setup, and effectiveness, etc. And epistemic violence is deeply embedded in our knowledge as well as in the ways on which we strive towards it." So this is exactly the definition of epistemic violence. Yeah. So this is the way we see things and explain the world. Yeah. And now you mentioned the very important topic that is now going on in the Sahel region. You lived in Mali, where now Ibrahim Traoré is in power.
No. Ibrahim Traoré is in power in Burkina Faso.
Sorry.
Yeah. Assimi Goïta is in power in
absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. And you're an expert on Western Africa, where the ECOWAS is now threatening to sanction these governments that are now in charge, and they are even threatening with war. And you also told me before the interview that you have contacts, that you still have friends and contacts and connections in Africa and in the region. What is your opinion on the political situation there? Because I heard many things. For example, the Western media portrayed it now as a threat to global security because of migration, that EU funding is now stopped because, you know, and without this, migrants will, so to speak, flood the EU. And others are telling us that, yeah, this is a rebel group and illegal, and yeah, they are to a certain degree right. On the other hand, I see some enthusiasts, maybe on the left political spectrum, that are, you know, cheering and saying, yeah, this is a liberation, a fight for liberation, and then decolonial struggle. And I'm confused because I see that, yeah, that there is some critical aspects of it, you know, overthrowing a government with violence and with the military is not a good thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I see some positive aspects, that they are willing to, you know, nationalize their gold mines and eat their resources. And Ibrahim Traoré had a wonderful speech that he asked, why is Africa one of the richest countries in the world, and why should we always go and back to Western politicians? Please give us this and that. And yeah, so he touched my heart, but at the same time, I'm critical also of this movement. So I'm afraid that it's violent and yeah, but please help me out.
It is a complicated situation, and I cannot say it's good or it's bad. I think there is aspects of the both sides. On the one hand, I can tell you when Mali was having the first coup and threw Ibrahim Boubacar Keita out and his government, a lot of people were for this coup, because the level of corruption that we had seen at the time was, unsupportable. The nepotism and the money siphoning was just unsupportable. But this was the case, just to tell you, even the arrival of the jihadists in Timbuktu 2012, even they had said that they are going to combat corruption and nepotism, which is why initially the population was not necessarily against them. Only when they turned very fundamentalist in terms of the application of Sharia, when they started, cutting hands and things like that. And at the same time, the population saw, but they are, smoking themselves, which was prohibited. They are abusing girls, which was not allowed, and so on. That's when the situation changed. So the issue of corruption has been there for a very long time and has been used by successive coups, to say that we want to address this. The second thing is the neo-colonial structures that existed. The France CFR still exists in the whole of West Africa, which is managed, if you like, through, the gold that Mali is depositing in France. France has no gold itself. Mali has gold, but the gold that Mali has, a lot of it is in France. The uranium of Niger, where does it go? It goes to France. The development programs in the region are not to be compared with the profits that are being made from the resources. So, unfortunately, I think the motivation for change is understandable, while I do not agree to coup d'etats. But now we are faced with this situation, and I think that it would be extremely dangerous to intervene, whether it's ECOWAS or other people to intervene, because the whole Sahel has been developed in an area of conflict through the first intervention, which I think was, illegal, the bombing of Libya. I was in Chad at that time, and we had over 100,000 Chadians coming back from Libya. That means 100,000 Chadians who had worked in Libya, who had made money in Libya, who had seen a different level of development, because if you compare Libya at the time with what Chad looked like, these people were used to, you know, proper infrastructure, regular salaries. They even sent money home, you know, to support their families. And now all the people that actually I received when I went to Fayalago various times, coming on these huge trucks, sitting on top, you know, completely dehydrated, and needing support, you know, that we gave them with the doctors and nurses at the hospital that had 40 beds, 40. And there were every day there were arrivals, like 500 or more, you know, arrivals that needed support. Now all these people came back and all of a sudden had no job. Instead, they become an additional mouth to feed for the families that were used to receiving maybe $50 a month, which doesn't seem to be a lot for us. But if you have nothing, $50 is a lot, you know. And now these people were sitting there not knowing what to do. I do think that there has been some research on this. That unfortunately a number of these young men, because 90% of the people who came back from Libya into Chad were men. We had very few children and very few women that came back. So, you know, these young men then were faced with a situation of unemployment, faced with a situation of living in an area of complete underdevelopment in Western Chad, in the Mao region. And the Mao region is close to the border with Nigeria. You know, Maiduguri is next door, if you like. And unfortunately, I think a number of them decided then to join the Boko Haram. And so, you know, this one intervention has caused already so much disaster in the region, including the return of militarily trained Malians that came back with their arms, also with some money. You know, all this has caused a lot of conflict in the region, a lot of violence in the region. And I think, you know, there's something that has been triggered at the time that now is difficult, you know, to rein in again. And I fear that if there is another intervention, it's just going to get worse. I mean, generally, as you know, I'm also involved in the peace movement. I think whatever conflict is there, conflict is a normality. We all have conflicts, but it's the way that we deal with them. And it's, I think, rather rare that you can't find an opportunity to resolve the conflict. You were right, there's two narratives about what's going on. The one narrative is democracy is lost, you know, this is now, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth coup in the region. It's Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali has had 2 coups, Niger, and I don't know, I think it's 5 or 6 coups, you know, that have happened in the region. If you listen to Ibrahim Traore in Burkina, he says all the right things. You know, I really believe he's a young guy. I really believe also what he says. But what I am a little bit critical of all the coup leaders is, if you are so interested to decolonize further, why don't you invest much more in education? Why don't you do much more for the development of your population? Instead, you know, there's again, as you know, in Mali, they have restarted conflict between the parties that have signed the peace agreement in 2015. And so, you know, if you really are convinced that you want to decolonize, and yes, I am completely in sync with you when you say, well, they're nationalizing the gold mines, they have stopped the export of uranium. Yes, I think it's a good idea, you know, to actually gain the right equilibrium for a proper agreement, because they have been not, they have not received, you know, what they should have received. Otherwise, the country would not remain the poorest, one of the poorest in the world. Uranium is not something that you buy for $1 a kilo. So, you know, so my issue is, okay, if you are using that type of narrative, then I want to see what you can do for the population. Because even if you say, okay, we have debt and we don't have money, you know, I believe that whatever situation you are in, you can always show that you want to do something. Maybe you can't do it on a large scale immediately, but if you want to do something for education, you can start and do something. As they have been able to convince the population that they need to enroll as volunteers to fight for the country. I think they should have a similar program to recruit volunteers to teach the children, because there is people who have even studied outside, who have been to universities, who have been to, you know, who have had an education. So even if you have not, like in the Western world, the appropriate certificate to become a teacher, if there is no teachers available, you have to use those people who have a level of capacity, who can teach. And you have to do maybe a kind of a program to bring them to a kind of a standard so that, you know, something can be done and every child that goes to school gets a similar level of education. You can't say, okay, go teach, and somebody starts teaching philosophy and another one says, well, I can't do mathematics, I'll talk about literature, and the other one will say, oh, me, I'm a great sports person, let's just do sports. Or, you know, I mean, that's not acceptable. But if you wanted to do something, then you would focus and you would say, okay, I want to get the 10 most educated people in the country to form, let's say, an education commission and come up with a proposal. What can we do to support education in our country, to get our children into school, to get critical thinking, to get Black history on the curriculum, to get confidence building, you know, literature from Wole Soyinka, you know, and from Chimamanda Adichie, and so on can be. I mean, it's not like Africa doesn't have. There's so much wealth, you know, in the literature field, in all the fields, as a matter of fact. But I don't see that, and that's my momentarily still my question mark, where this is going from the side of the people who are responsible for the coup d'etats, because I see very little in this respect, if anything.
I agree with your assessment. Do you believe that the majority of the people support the coup leaders in for example, Mali or Burkina Faso or the other places? Or is it that, for example, it is like a division? Maybe the richer people, or maybe the people who are dependent or privileged in some ways in their and also influenced by maybe Western, I don't know, schools and universities and maybe politicians. So let's call it elite. Do you believe that the elite is more pro-Western and maybe the poor working class is more pro-coup leaders? Is it as simple as this, or how can we understand, or is it that the majority is for the coup or against the coup? How can we understand the thinking and then the ordinary people?
I think for Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger, we don't have any research yet, because Niger has just been recently, you know, undergone this. Burkina Faso has so many problems. I don't think that there's anybody doing research on that at the moment. Guinea, I haven't heard, but I've seen an article today by Christian Klatt, who is the head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Mali. And he cited a document that they publish regularly. It's called Mali Maître. And in there, they have found that, for instance, the division is rather between the north and the south. So it has not much to do with rich and poor, but it's along the lines of the division that existed and created the conflict between the North and the South. For instance, the Northerners are also much more in favor of MINUSMA staying rather than leaving. Because even though they had a lot of challenges in those regions, the Blue Helmets, they were, just through their presence, at least giving a kind of security feeling, I would say, in the towns where they were, deployed. And I think it is a little bit similar concerning the coup, because what's the insecurity that is going on is happening rather in the north and in the center of the country. So the majority of people feel that the security that has been a challenge all the time, while MINUSMA was there with 13,000 deployees, while Barkhane was there with 5,000 deployees, while the G5 was there and the Operation Takuba, this cannot be replaced by the National Army pretty quickly. These are large numbers. And again, I always say, Mali is not Luxembourg. It's a huge country. And, it is already a big challenge to secure the borders in the desert, for instance, but also in the desertic areas in the north of the country. It's very complicated. And not everybody can do that. So, that is another challenge. You were talking about the migration issue. I must say my biggest criticism goes, to the countries of Europe, how they manage it, because there's the roots of the problem. And they seem to fight the symptom, namely the people who are arriving, and they seem to be okay with the fact that these people are, killed in the Mediterranean by the pushback operations. I still remember when we had these 5 super rich people who had gone to look for the Titanic somewhere, and how this was depicted in the media for these 5 people who lost their lives, which is very sad. But at the same time, hundreds of people were drowning and, being drowned in the Mediterranean. And, it's like, okay, it's like a regular kind of occurrence. And only every now and then when a picture comes up, I still remember this little boy that was lying on the beach, at some stage, and then everybody was getting very worked up. Well, does it mean that other people's lives don't count? I mean, the women, the young men, the old men, it doesn't count. And where is the moral and ethical kind of reaction when we sign, the European Union recently signed an agreement with Tunisia, and it's already documented that Tunisia pushes these illegal migrants into the desert, towards the border with Niger, and they leave them there. And then, it's unbelievable. And at the same time, these are the same politicians arriving in Africa talking about human rights and the rights of gays and lesbians and queers and all these other people. I'm very sorry, I have no patience for that. Africa has 120 other more important problems. And I really take a great exception to every politician that arrives and gives a big speech about the rights of these minorities. Don't misunderstand me. I'm for the protection of minority rights, but there is majority rights that are not being adhered to. And these migrants who are leaving there and being killed either in the ocean, in the Mediterranean, or in the desert, this is systemic violence. This is, knowledge. We know what we're doing. This is not something we don't know, but we we are okay. It seems we are okay with this. The political establishment is okay with this. And it's the same people who then come and preach about human rights, given that also you look at the history, the colonial history, the history of slavery, who did what to who. And then you come now and you're still representing that same civilization, I'm sorry. And you talk to Africans about, democracy and human rights. I mean, it's a farce. It's a farce. And I couldn't be more angry about these people. And I can only hope that they are all going to be dethroned as quickly as possible.
It makes me sad, yeah, and watching the news makes me even sadder. So I discussed with Professor Werner Wintersteiner something that also we touched on upon now, the dilemma, or how can I phrase it? I'm not sure, but yeah, it's some sort of dilemma, paradox. I'm not using the right word, but that Western liberal democracies have, for example, not only the most military expenditure, but also that they killed much more people and invaded much more countries illegally. In the history, in recent history. I'm not talking about colonialism. I'm talking about after World War II and recent history. And on the other hand, non-democracy, democratic states and failed democracies and failed states, like, for example, Libya, China, and others, who are, not a not a functioning democracy, one can say. But how can we explain this ambivalence that, but they don't invade other countries, or they did not kill millions of Iraqis and Afghanis and other. So it's a dilemma that we, as pro-democratic people, as people for peace should address both sides. So when, for example, you were talking about Libya, one can also cut the video and the short form and then say, look, this is propaganda. You are for an authoritarian regime because, like Saddam Hussein and like the other authoritarian leaders, they had some socialist programs, but on the other hand, they suppressed other people, killed many other people inside their country. So we have to live with this, this ambivalence and so
I think there's a lot that needs to be done. First of all, our media landscape has to change. I mean, we don't have journalists anymore. In Germany, we had a scandal recently, how many journalists are paid by the government, which means it's only the narrative that the government wants that is going to be listened to. I am flabbergasted sometimes because, I mean, I haven't been alive during the Second World War. But I have heard so many stories from my grandfather, from my father, within the family. And to see the Russophobia that exists currently in Germany particularly, but I think also in other countries in Europe, is completely, I don't understand it. I mean, it was first of all Russia that started to liberate us from fascism. It wasn't America, France, and Britain. They came onto the boat for liberation much, much later. They made a lot of, money still with the Hitler regime. And Russia has lost 27 million people because of that world war that we started. Nobody else has lost so many people. Nobody else. And still, we do not understand why Russia could be afraid that, weapons of mass destruction are coming closer and closer to the border. I mean, it's ridiculous. I saw an interview by somebody, I think it was an American general, and I was flabbergasted. He said Russia has come closer and closer to NATO. And a journalist intervened and he said, no, it's NATO who came closer and closer to Russia, which is why the Russian army is now closer to NATO. And he just didn't want to hear this. He refused to hear the difference in this, because obviously if you move closer to Russia, then yes, the Russian arms are closer to you. But Russia hasn't moved from its positions. So I mean, I really feel that either the media, but also the education system, the issue of critical thinking, maybe it's the influence of the social media, the repetition of the wrong information so many times that the rumors become reality, but the feeling also that despite the fact that we have much more opportunity to inform ourselves, we're actually informing ourselves less and less. And it might not be you and me because we read and we do, but what I see among the young people now, it's, everybody plays the games, everybody is on the internet all the time, but they're not reading, they are not informing themselves. There's a level of superficiality, let's put it that way, or mediocrity that cannot, I mean, I'm flabbergasted that we have this level of education. And you know that in the Western world, education has been privatized. There's more and more private schools. The schools in Germany, I know they have 30,000 teachers missing. I mean, how are you going to give quality education if you have so many teachers missing in the system? And then you want to have quality education. Nowadays, it's more you learn for a test. So you learn certain things that you spit out at the test, but you do not learn to question. Even university studies have been changed into more of a school-like system where you have to have homework and then tests and homework and tests, which I saw with my daughter when she went to university, that you don't even have time to, for instance, engage politically in anything. I mean, you're just constantly under pressure. There's another piece of paper, another certificate, another point to be gained, that you lose all opportunity of freedom. The last thing is, okay, if we talk about democracy, are we so convinced that we have it? I mean, I was already talking about, the propaganda machine and the narratives and so on. I saw the speech by our chancellor in Munich. I mean, it's horrific. It's horrific. He shouted at people who want peace. He called them fallen angels from hell. This is, I mean, I'm happy I don't live in Germany anymore, but it is abhorrent that a politician of that level, of that normally standing, I don't know, he's not having any standing in my eyes, but this is a divisive speech. It is using religious pictures. And if somebody says you are from hell, you're not going to engage with somebody from hell to talk about any problem. You're just going to say, well, you are on another level. You are in hell already. I mean, I can't talk to you. And this is something that they have done in West Africa with the jihadists. When we had the national conferences of reconciliation, where more than 1,000 people participated, and we had, I think, 3 of such. Each time, one of the recommendations was, we need to speak, we need to negotiate with the jihadist, because the population also understood the jihadist is a symptom. There's a problem before the jihadist occurred. And they were particularly positive on having negotiations, at least with the Al-Qaeda part of the jihadist movement, because the Islamic State people are much more fundamentalist. But you gain at least a little bit, I don't know if you look at historically where the it was possible to gain or to defeat, terrorist movements militarily anywhere. I am not aware. Whether you start with the IRA in Northern Ireland, it ended in negotiations. Okay, decades later, but all these decades, people died. For what? And, Nelson Mandela was declared a terrorist for years with the ANC, the PAC, and many others, even when he had already received the Nobel Peace Prize. You have to wonder sometimes, why certain approaches are not used. At least try. If it fails, you can still continue with your madness, but at least you have tried. But whenever this was proposed, immediately, either the Prime Minister of France or the Defense Minister of France, once our Vice Chancellor arrived, because Germany was also against negotiating with jihadists. And the people of Mali, at least some of them told me, we don't understand. When your nationals are being kidnapped by jihadists, you negotiate. You do. Here, the whole country has been kidnapped. We're in the hands of these people, and you don't want to negotiate. What is this? And you even pay. I mean, it's always refused, that payment has been made to liberate kidnapped people. But in many cases, money has been changing hands, And so the population sees, that hypocrisy. Here we do it, there we don't do it. And it's not only in terms of the kidnapped people. It's in terms of, you have to have proper democracy. You have to have human rights for these people. When you fight for the human rights of the whole country, it doesn't make sense to talk about a minority. You're fighting for these human rights for everybody, because somebody who lives along the poverty line, he has no human rights and he has no dignity, something that the UN-Charta underlines so strongly. So, it's the hypocrisy that people see now, that, that behavior. The other day I saw a little clip. An African from the street was interviewed, and he said, why don't these people, Kamala Harris had been in West Africa, why doesn't she go to Saudi Arabia, and talk about the rights of gays, and talk about the rights of, women who have been raped, because you are going to be punished as a woman if you have been raped. It's not the rapist, and why don't they talk to all these Middle Eastern countries, where the situation is much worse, because, they have other interests there. There's something to be gained, so they're not going to, and this is one of the things which I feel a lot of African people have understood, that hypocrisy, that here you do it. If you look at who is in front of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, it's mainly African, because of what? They don't have the power and the glory, because a lot of Africans say, when they hear the request, Mr. Putin has to be arrested. You saw maybe the interviews before the BRICS meeting in South Africa, where the government of South Africa has said, well, we want to see Mr. Putin here. We are not going to arrest him, despite the fact that they are signatories to the ICC, because what we feel is, and this was somebody from the streets in a country in Africa, what we want to see is justice for everybody. So why is Mr. Blair not there? Why is Mr. Sarkozy not there? Why is Mr. Bush not there? Because these people have killed so many people. Anybody else who has followed cannot even reach that level. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, all these countries are being destroyed. So many people have lost their lives, because of this either lies, like with Iraq, pure lies. Nobody has apologized for it. never mind seen justice. So, you know, there is an awakening. There's an awakening not only in Africa, but also in Asia, South America. And political leadership is changing, as we have seen in Brazil, I think Venezuela and some other places. And we will see what happens now with the BRICS in South Africa, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. We are no more what we used to be. We are on our way to a much more multipolar world. And it's not yet there, and it might not be fully established quickly, but it's a new reality. And I think politicians in Europe and North America have not yet understood the significance of all this. And it's of their own making, in a way.
Absolutely, yes. And it makes me angry and sad at the same time, the whole situation and hypocrisy and yeah, all the stuff. I remember the German philosopher Richard David Brecht said in a wonderful, I believe it was a event organized by Jung und Naiv, which is a great YouTube channel. And Richard David Brecht said that maybe we are afraid that, for example, big powers like China could do the same as we did for more than 5 centuries. So maybe it's on a psychological level that we are afraid that maybe when they came to power, when maybe we finally got our multipolar world, that they can do the same thing. So it's also a good explanation, I believe. But yeah, nonetheless,
it's a transfer, it's a projection of what you have done, you think the other one is going to do. And I don't see any indication of that yet. You know, if you listen to the interventions of Xi Jinping, if you listen even to Putin, to me, it's much more rational what they say often than what we hear from our politicians. And, you know, maybe it's the fear of losing the power. But I think the projections that they make, I don't think that that is something that is going to happen. China is much more interested in economic ties. They are much more interested, you know, to have cooperative relationships. Look what they have done with the Iran-Iraq situation, Saudi Arabia as well. They try their level best even to play a role in the Ukraine peace making. I think, you know, the West just doesn't want to see that. And I'm not saying these are perfect places. You know, I haven't been to China. I haven't been to Russia. But we have to, at some stage, understand either we want to believe, and Russia, unfortunately, has much more reason not to believe what is said. Because remember the Minsk accords were signed, Minsk 1 and 2. And it was Mrs. Merkel who gave an interview years later to say, oh, this was never really, you know, something that we wanted to implement. We just wanted to buy time. And there's so many examples of, you know, narrative that was not meant. I mean, this issue of hypocrisy is so stringent, you know, it is so regular. It is visible to everybody. People who have a minimum understanding will identify this hypocrisy. And, you know, this is unfortunate. There's Jürgen Todenhöfer. He's even written a book. I think it's called Die große Heuchelei, something like that, the big hypocrisy, where he unplugs this whole issue of human rights and so on and so on, and says, well, look at your history and then find out how many other countries where you want to now ask for the adherence to human rights have done that. They should come to you to say, you know, you stop these genocides, stop these slavery, this colonialism, this economic exploitation, and so on, even in your own countries, because it's not like there's no economic exploitation in our own countries.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, we have our own problems, and yeah, maybe in the end, let's keep it short. We met each other at the International Summit for Peace for Ukraine in Vienna few weeks or months ago. Let's explain the audience what happened there. What did you saw? What feeling did you get? Because media portrayed it as a Russian propaganda. The Ukrainian ambassador in Vienna also, successfully managed that the ÖGB, the biggest workers' union, canceled the event room. So it was a big debate going on before even the conference started. So you were there. I also have some points that I'm critical of, but in general, maybe you can talk about that as well.
I mean, I have started, since I've been on pension, I'm engaging, in various groups to advance the idea of peace through peaceful means. Because I think this issue, everybody says they're for peace. Even the people who deliver weapons say they're for peace, but I think that is important. So when I saw this conference, I thought, I have to go there. Because I always feel it's important to meet the people who are like in a similar frame of mind. And I'm really happy I did, even though I was really confused because I saw that, 2 days before that we didn't know where to meet. And I wrote a number of emails to say, well, where are we meeting now? I didn't even know why this had been canceled. I mean, it was mind-boggling. And so when I arrived, I was really happy that they had found the room, because doing such a thing as a Zoom is very different. You don't have an opportunity to have a coffee or a glass of wine with somebody, to talk a little bit and understand a little bit why this other person is there and so on. And that was my objective. I wanted to meet like-minded people, and I did. So that was already a big plus, that we actually could physically get together. And I'm extremely grateful that they were able to do that. I think they talked about participants from 34 countries or so. And so to see the mix of people really engaged, in these different working groups, but also listening to the interventions from the podium. I must say I was particularly impressed by, I think it was a president of Bolivia or vice president, who introduced, I mean, I really would like, if you have the hand on his presentation somewhere, if you could send it to me, because I remember he was talking about, indigenous knowledge, and indigenous ways of seeing the world and interpreting the world. And I always think, there's so much that we could learn maybe from different indigenous groups, how they relate to nature, how they relate to conflict, how they relate. They really have a lot of different types of experiences and wisdom. So that was a second really important point for me, to meet people and hear, from different cultures, different viewpoints. I was very impressed by Yuri. I think he is a Ukrainian peace activist who in the meantime has been arrested, I think. I'm not sure whether he's
under
released.
house arrest. His flat was the special forces from the Ukraine, the SBU, I believe they are called. They entered his flat, and they handed over to him governmental declaration or something like legal case that that he is repeating Russian propaganda.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that.
Well, that's always the same. I mean, it happens to us. We don't get arrested, but if I talk about, whoever, about my position towards the war there, about my position against delivery of weapons, a lot of people say, "Well, you're a Putin lover, or you must be really right wing," you know, which is, I mean, it's ridiculous. But this is how the general population has been primed by the propaganda, because that is the way that they want us to lose our standing. If everybody and now our chancellor has said we are angels, fallen angels from hell. I mean, how can you top this? It is impossible. So I really felt, that to me was important. I was a little bit disappointed that there were few people from Ukraine and from Russia, but I also appreciate that that must have been difficult, for them to come. I was very impressed by the intervention of Claire Daly, the MEP from Ireland. The working group that I was in, that was managed by Rainer Brown, was really interesting, looking at the different peace proposals, even though the time was so short. I mean, it was not possible really to go into the depths of things. But for me, the most important thing was that I met a few people, and I'm actually in contact still with Gregory and Ina. We met at the same table. And we've written a paper, how to establish a proposal, I should say, a peace council at the United Nations, which we are trying to get support for from the VIPs, either in the political sphere or, professors like Jeffrey Sachs and others. Because looking at the failure of the Security Council in that matter, because of the situation with the P5, there will always be a veto, about certain things. And so we felt that if there's a peace council that is maybe made up of countries that have not been or are not in war and have not this warlike culture, and could have an influence, that would be a good idea. So I'm trying to do my best on that. It's not easy because the political elites nowadays, they're all very straight in their straitjackets, and what needs to be done. So the conference, the summit, I really thought it was important for me. Where I see a shortcoming is really the follow-up. Because so far I have inquired and I have written once or twice, but I don't see, that we have taken that opportunity to push the issue further. Instead, I think we are now all back in our respective jobs and lives and so on. And I haven't seen something consolidated by the organizers or other members, participants who have been there. So that I find is a real shortcoming.
I understand you. And I hope you have success with the Peace Council. And I believe Ina sent me also the document, but I couldn't found the time to read it completely, but I will do in the next days. So yeah, with that, I don't have any further questions, and I thank you very much for your share that you're sharing your experience and your knowledge, and I learned a lot. And also thank you for all the wisdom and for the opinions, and I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm very glad we did it.
Well, it's interesting. We nearly had 2 hours, I see.
Yes.
Time flies, huh?
Time flies. Yes. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you once again very much. I enjoyed talking to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joseph.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a nice evening.